All right, beginning today, we're going to start looking at events that are going to occur after we're all in heaven. But before we begin today, I want to take a few minutes and review what we've covered so far. Now, we began this whole thing by looking at the prophets themselves. We showed that they are true prophets of God and that they can be trusted. So since all their past predictions came true, we can be sure that their predictions concerning future events are going to come true as well. Next, we looked at the nations who were going to act out the last great drama in the history of mankind. We identified the main players who were going to fight World War III, and we started with the nation of Israel that was reborn politically on March 14th or May 14th, 1948. Then there was the northern king called Gog from the land of Magog. We discovered that this nation was Russia, and that it will be ally itself with the nations of the old Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Then that alliance will join forces with the Muslim nations in the Middle East that will be led by Iran and Syria and supported by Russian weapons, and they will attack Israel from the north. Then we looked at the kings of the south, who we discovered were the Muslim nations of northern Africa, led by Egypt. They will join forces with the black African nations in Central and Southern Africa. And again, supported by Russian weapons, they will attack Israel from the south. Then we looked at the kings of the east, which are the Oriental nations under the leadership of Communist China. The next major player was Rome. This is going to be the 10-nation confederacy that came out of the heritage of the old Roman Empire. The European Union, or an organization like it, seems to be the best candidate for that position. Even though there are more than 10 nations in that group at the moment, there are only about 10 of them who really have any clout. The rest of them sort of along for the ride. So either 10 of the nations from the European Union or an organization like it will also join together with the battle against Israel. Sounds like it will be Israel against the world. Then we looked at the last great dictator, the Antichrist, who will rule over this 10-nation confederacy. He'll start out claiming that he's going to protect Israel, but 3.5 years into the Great Tribulation, he will declare that he is God and force the people to worship him. This guy will be given aid and comfort by Mystery Babylon, which is the apostate church, led by the Antichrist sidekick, the false prophet. My guess is that this will be a hybrid religion that will be a modified form of Islam. The next event on the church's prophetic calendar is the rapture. This is where God will remove all of the remaining true believers from the earth. This will leave the man-made church totally devoid of any true Christians. So as a result, the apostate church will join together under the wing of Islam to form the worldwide hybrid church that will worship the Antichrist and kill anybody who refuses to do it. We can see the beginnings of this trend as Pope Francis tries to get Roman Catholics to embrace other religions as equals. So all that's left is the apostate church. All that's left is the apostate church that will help the Antichrist gain power and persecute anyone who refuses to follow him. And this will happen during the last 3.5 years of the 7-year period that we call the Great Tribulation. And this brings us to today's lesson. I wonder why it is that in spite of all the terrible lessons that are learned from past wars and terrifying predictions of what a future war would be like, mankind continues to play on the edge of complete destruction. This really shouldn't surprise anyone who's familiar with the prophetic writings. Jesus predicted that mankind would not learn anything from history. He told us that mankind would eventually plunge the world into a war that was so vast and so utterly destructive that only the physical return of Jesus himself would prevent the total annihilation of all life on earth. And Jesus said, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." Mankind will not stop making war because people refuse to accept the basic cause of war, which is their sin. People simply refuse to accept the fact that they have a sinful nature. And because of that, they refuse to recognize the fact that inside each of us is a selfish, self-centered jerk. We are always looking out for ourselves. This is the cause of almost all the conflict in the world. Because of our selfish nature, we can never have any consistent peace with ourselves, our families, or our neighbors, and on a larger scale with other nations. Over the past few weeks, we've talked about some of the world powers that will rise to prominence just before Jesus returns. We can see that many of them are already world powers, and we can see that they are aligning themselves politically just the way the Bible says they would. Well, today we're going to trace the events that will lead to Armageddon. We're going to look at the various battles. We'll see who is going to fight them, and we'll see how each of these armies is destroyed. Now, please understand this. Just about everything that we're going to talk about today could happen in a totally different way. God has a habit of fulfilling prophecy in a way that we least expect Him to, so I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is the only way that God could fulfill these prophecies. I mean, who knows, 5 years from now, there might be a totally different scenario that's just as plausible. But don't forget what I said at the very beginning of these lessons. My purpose is to show you that the prophecies can be fulfilled this way. In other words, everything is in place for them to be fulfilled right now. God's divine alarm clock is ticking away the final moments of man's history, and that bell is going to ring at any moment. Now, when the Jews reestablished themselves politically in Israel in 1948, they caused an unsolvable problem. Even though the Jews have always been the majority population in that area of the world, the land of Israel has been controlled by Muslims for most of the last 1,200 years, and more specifically by Arab Muslims for about 600 of those years. You see, Islam did not exist as a religion until Muhammad invented it in the 7th century A.D. And since Muhammad was illiterate, the Quran wasn't really written until 70 years after he was dead. But that doesn't matter to Muslims. You see, they don't really think that Muhammad actually created Islam. They think that Muhammad simply restored the original religion that had been corrupted by the Jews and the Christians. And the first Muslims were all Arabs. But the basic hostility between Arabs and Jews goes much farther back than that. It goes all the way back to the tents of their mutual ancestor, Abraham. It actually began as a conflict between Abraham's son Isaac, whose father was his wife Sarah, and Abraham's son Ishmael, whose mother was the Egyptian servant Hagar. Isaac's descendants became the Jewish people, and Ishmael's descendants became the Arab people. And we're not talking about a simple 20th century dispute over some real estate. This is an extremely volatile situation, and nothing anyone says or does is ever going to change that. Looking at it from the Jewish point of view, God promised that land to Abraham, and the Jews have been the majority population there for the last 4,000 years. They had political control of the area of the world until the Babylonian defeat in 586 BC. Even then, Israel was considered to be occupied Jewish territory until 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and the Jews were scattered all over the world in what has become known as the diaspora. But even then, the Romans only expelled them from the area around Jerusalem. That still left a rather large Jewish population in Samaria and Galilee. Well, even under Muslim control, the Muslims really didn't have any interest in that area, so the Jews were pretty much left alone. The Bible tells us that the land would never produce anything for Gentiles, and that explains why the Muslims weren't all that interested in Israel. You see, you could never see anything of value coming out of that area. Now, during World War I, the Muslims in the Middle East were told that if they would revolt against the Ottoman Empire that controlled most of the Middle East since the 16th century, Great Britain would honor Arab independence. Well, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, there was a misunderstanding over exactly what that meant. And the British and the French divided up control of the old Ottoman Empire between them. This was complicated even farther when Great Britain came out in support of the formation of the Jewish nation's homeland in 1917. This move was legitimized by the League of Nations when they sanctioned British and French control over the area in 1922. So the Arabs felt betrayed. You see, they thought that they were going to get control of the entire Middle East. But Great Britain said that they only promised to honor Arab independence in the area that they already controlled. This all came to a head in 1936 when the Arabs revolted. Now, this was a lot more complicated than that, but for the purpose of this lesson, I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can. Well, politicians will be politicians, and in 1937 they formed the Peel Commission to try to find out what was bugging the Arabs. And the testimony before the commission tells us why, prior to 1948, the Arabs all agreed that there was no such thing as a Palestinian who was not a Jew. A prominent Arab leader, Anu Bey Abdul Hadi, said this to the Peel Commission in 1937. There is no such thing as Palestine. Palestine is a term that Zionists invented. There is no Palestine in the Bible. Our country was for centuries part of Syria. Well, in May of 1947, the Arab Higher Committee to the United Nations released this statement. Palestine was part of Syria politically. The Arabs of Palestine were not independent in the sense of forming a separate political entity. Ahmad Shakari, who would go on to become the chairman of the terrorist organization known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is sometimes called the PLO, told the United Nations, "It is common knowledge that Palestine is nothing more than southern Syria." In 1946, Philip Hitti, who was a professor of Arab American history in Princeton University, said this to the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry: "There is no such thing as Palestine in history, absolutely not." As late as March of 1977, Zaire Moussine, who was a high-ranking leader of the PLO, said this in an interview with a Dutch newspaper: "The Palestinian people do not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only the means for continuing the struggle with the state of Israel." You see, there has never been a distinctive Palestinian language. There has never been a distinctive Palestinian culture. There has never been a distinctive Palestinian history. And there has never been a distinctive Palestinian nation. Add to that the fact that even when Muslims controlled the area, the Jews were basically governing themselves for the last 200 years, and so you can see the problem. So you'll never convince the Jews that they don't have a legal right to live there. They feel that the Romans robbed them of that right in 70 AD, and they were living there 2,000 years before Islam was ever created. So you see, to the Jews, they're only claiming what was rightfully theirs all along. Now let me illustrate what I mean. In 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, about 960 Jews fled the city and they took up refuge on a mesa outside of Jerusalem. This is the fortress on the top of that mesa that was built in 40 BC by Herod the Great. And next to the temple itself is probably the best known site in Jewish history. The fortress is called Masada. The small band of Jews held out for almost 2 years against the might of a 9,000-man Roman army. Then, when Masada was on the verge of defeat in 72 AD, the survivors killed themselves rather than surrendering to the Romans. Their defiant spirit was so strong that they even refused to eat all the food they had stored there. They purposely did that, and they left some food there in the storerooms so that the Romans could not say that they starved them out. They didn't want the Romans to be able to brag that they had conquered Masada. Well, this same defiant spirit was alive and well in Israel today. The motto of the modern Israeli army is, "Masada shall never fall again." And today the Jews are just as ready to die rather than surrender. Centuries of persecution of being people without a country has taught the Jews one very important lesson. Israel is the only place on earth where they have ever been reasonably secure. And to them, if they are to survive as a people, Israel must remain under Jewish control. So in addition to considering it to be their divine right to be in Israel, remaining there is looked upon as being the only way that Jews can survive as a people. And the Jews feel that if they are ever driven out of Israel, they're going to die anyway, so they might just as well die defending their right to be there. Now this attitude has given birth to what the Jews call the Samson option. At Masada, the people killed themselves rather than surrender to the Romans. Well, in the biblical story of Samson, when he killed himself, he took his captors with him. This plan, it was almost put into effect during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Early in the war, it looked as though the Israeli army was going to be defeated. So it's reported that the Israeli defense minister, Moshe Dayan, was supposed to have told Prime Minister Golda Meir that everything was lost and that they needed to arm the doomsday weapon and put into effect the Samson option. So on October 8, 1973, Israel called its first nuclear alert and armed its nuclear weapons. Then they aimed them at every Muslim capital in the world. If Israel was going to die, she was taking her enemies with her. Well, some very heroic bluffing by an Israeli tank commander, along with some hesitation on the part of the Syrian commander, turned the tide of battle in Israel and prevented a nuclear holocaust that day. Of course, we all know that the real reason that it didn't happen that day was that God decided that it just wasn't time for that to happen. Probably the poorest kept secret in the world is the fact that Israel has the ability to produce and deliver nuclear weapons. And at least in the past, she has been ready and willing to be the first one to use them if her survival was threatened. The Jews in Israel have decided that if they're going to die anyway, they're going to take their enemies with them. That is the Samson option. On the other hand, the Muslims are equally immovable. They claim that Christians and Jews actually corrupted Islam and wrote the Bible so that Isaac would appear to be the heir to the promises made to Abraham, and they were rightly for their ancestor Ishmael. So they were never accept the fact that Jews are in control of what they claim to be rightfully their land. The irony is, when they did control it, they didn't think that it was all that important. But now that it's under Jewish control, they suddenly claim that it is holy ground to them. You see, once a piece of land is controlled by Muslims, it becomes a part of what they call Dar al-Islam, and it belongs to Allah. So if they ever lose it, Muslims are bound by Sharia law to not rest until that land is returned to Muslim control. Well, whether they have a rightful claim to that land or not, they think that they do, and perception is reality. And that's all that matters. They claim that the British stole this land from them after World War I and then gave it to the Jews after World War II. And they believe that lie in spite of the fact that Jews have been the majority population in Israel for over 4,000 years. And the land was under British control and was populated by Jews, not Muslims, at the time Israel became a nation. The fact is, the Muslims consider it to be their sacred duty to exterminate the Jews and return the land to Allah. This is why they're willing to kill themselves in suicide bombings. They feel that the only way for them to be guaranteed a place in heaven is to die in this struggle. And the fact that they're corrupt, their concept of heaven is that it's a giant Playboy mansion in the sky, and Allah will give them 72 virgins to play with if they will kill themselves. It doesn't really hurt the recruitment of young men to be suicide bombers either. Now that women are becoming suicide bombers, I've often wondered what Allah is supposed to give them. So you see, there's no room for compromise in this situation. It's actually part of the Muslim religion to kill Jews and Christians. The Jews also see this as much more than simply a fight for their Holy Land. Even though they recognize the fact that God promised this land to Abraham, they see it as a fight for the survival of the Jewish people as well. So the whole situation is not about real estate. And land is simply an excuse. To the Muslim, it's his religious duty to kill all Jews and Christians, and they even call it a jihad, a holy war. They may put up a facade of compromise from time to time, but that's all it is. It's a facade. You see, the Quran teaches that all Muslims should get his enemy to trust him. And when they do that, to make peace with them. That way, their enemies will not attack them. And this will give them time enough to grow strong enough to defeat them. So you can't trust a Muslim to abide by any peace treaty that he may sign. So signing a piece of paper or redrawing a line on a map is never going to stop this conflict. You should solve every political issue tomorrow, and this struggle will still go on. I mean, it may change form, but it's still going to go on. And see, American politicians don't understand that. You see, after more than 4,000 years, this conflict is so deeply embedded in the culture and the religion of these two groups that I don't think that they even know how to get along anymore. Well, ideological issues aside, this whole thing is complicated even further by the fact that all of this is happening right on top of the bulk of the world's oil supply. Now, Western nations don't want to make the Arabs mad because they remember what the 1973 oil embargo did to their economies. This is why the focus on every nation in the world is on this unsolvable problem. And it's why they seem to feel that they need to try to find a diplomatic solution to end it. But I hope I've shown you why that will never happen. You'd be hard-pressed to find any major newspaper printed in the last 50 years that has not had something in it about this problem. Well, one of the first things that the Antichrist is going to do after he comes to power is to guarantee the safety of the nation of Israel. Daniel said this about him: he will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. That refers to a week of years, in other words, 7 years. According to Daniel, as soon as this treaty is signed, God will begin the countdown of the last week of Daniel's prophecy. This will be the last 7 years of human history. It's the time that we call the Great Tribulation. Well, because of this agreement with the Antichrist, Israel will be feeling pretty secure. So they decide that the time is right to reinstitute the sacrificial system, and that's spelled out in the law of Moses. And there is only one place on earth where that can happen: Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, which is also called the Temple Mount. And that will require the temple to be rebuilt on Mount Moriah. Well, that site's already occupied. So to build it, the Jews have to destroy the third holiest site in the Muslim faith, even though they made it up. They must destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and the Muslims are not going to like that one bit. Now, they won't do anything right away. They don't want to tangle with the Western countries that are being led by the Antichrist. You see, at this point, they're not strong enough to defeat him. But this single event is going to trigger the hostility that is going to ultimately lead to World War III. Now, there are people who will say that the Jews will just build the temple next to the mosque. But that idea is absolutely absurd. It's ridiculous to even think that the Jews would consider building God's temple anywhere near a pagan shrine. And the Muslims get mad if a Jew even walks near that mosque. Back in 2000, riots actually broke out among Muslims all over the world when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon walked across the courtyard of the Temple Mount. So you know that they'll never tolerate the Jewish temple being right next door to that mosque. Now, Isaiah warned the Jews about this agreement. He said, "Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death and with Sheol, we have an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come on us. For we have made lies our refuge, and in a falsehood we have taken shelter." And a few verses later he said, "Then your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overwhelming surge passes through, you will be beaten down by it." And Daniel continued, "And for half of the week," that's 3.5 years, "he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wings of abominations shall come one who makes desolation." That's the Antichrist. So after 3.5 years, the Antichrist will have become so popular in the Western world that he will actually be worshipped. And the apostate church would have accepted him as their Messiah. I'm not so sure that the Jews will actually follow suit and accept him as their Messiah because he isn't Jewish. But since the Jewish people are still looking for a political Messiah, they will accept him as a sort of Messiah figure. And since the church-age believers will already be in heaven, there won't be anyone left in the church to protest when the church accepts him as their Messiah. The only believers that will be on earth at that time will be the 144,000 Jewish Christians and their followers that are identified in Revelation chapter 7. But those people will actually be outside of the organized church. In fact, the church will actually consider them to be a heretical cult that refuses to worship the Antichrist. And as a result, they will be executed by the thousands. This reign of terror will make Hitler's Holocaust look like a Sunday school picnic. Okay, riding on the crest of all the public adoration, the Antichrist is going to go to Jerusalem, and in the Holy of Holies, in the newly constructed temple, he is going to tell the world that he is God, and that anybody who refuses to worship him will be killed. Paul wrote, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, proclaiming himself to be God." And Jesus said, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." That event will be the signal that will tell the believers on that day to head for the hills, because the battle of Armageddon is about to begin. Jesus went on, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house. And let the one who is in the field not run back and take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be great tribulation, such as not has been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." Well, we aren't sure exactly where they will go. Many feel that they are going to take refuge in the mountains and canyons of Petra. And once they're there, God is going to protect them. John described this scene in Revelation chapter 12. "And the woman, which represents all the Jewish converts who were alive during this time, fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God for her, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. On the Jewish religious calendar, a year is 360 days, so 1,260 days is 3.5 years. This is the time when World War III is going to be going on. And Petra is a type of area that would protect people from the effects of a nuclear explosion. So in order to make sure that the Antichrist can't kill off all of God's people, he sets aside a place for them to hide, and then protects them for the last half of the Great Tribulation. Well, almost immediately after the Antichrist declares himself to be God, the balance of power that he has established in the world is shattered. At this point, the entire world system crumbles, and God begins to show the world that the Antichrist cannot keep his promises. The thing that man feared most is now rushing at him like an out-of-control freight train, World War III. Daniel wrote, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him." Now, we identified the king of the south as the Arab African Confederacy that will rally around the banner of Islam and is being led by Egypt. At the same time, the other Muslim countries in the Middle East that will join together under the leadership of Iran as their religious leader and Syria as their military leader, and they'll join up with Russia and her allies. Muslims already consider it to be their religious duty to destroy Israel, and they're going to see the turmoil that was created in Israel by the Antichrist defamation of the temple as a perfect opportunity to get revenge for the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. They feel that this chaos will trigger the return of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi. Then Daniel says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him," meaning the Antichrist forces in Israel. "But the king of the north will rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many great ships, and he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through." Russia is already allied with the Arabs and the Africans, and the Russians have already signed agreements with Iran to fight on their side. Well, Russia uses this as an excuse to launch an all-out attack on the Middle East. You see, to Russia, Israel is a very valuable piece of real estate. It is a land bridge between Europe, Africa, and Asia. And besides that, Russia has a particular interest in that area. You see, Russia desperately needs a warm water port. Russia's international trade is severely hampered because all of her deep water ports are iced in during the Russian winter. So it's very costly to keep those ports open, even to minimal trade during the winter months. A warm weather port on the Mediterranean Sea would be a real shot in the arm for the Russian economy. But that's not possible. Isn't the news media telling us that Russia is getting westernized? I mean, I thought they were our friends now. But are they? Putin doesn't see the U.S. as a threat anymore. I mean, picture this. It's a cold night in November, and the train is pulling out of the station. The last car in that train is a cattle car, and it's jammed full of famous Russian political leaders. President Vladimir Putin, economist Igor Gager, dissident Andrei Sakharov's widow, and the train is bound for a Siberian prison camp. That is a scenario that appears in a book written by a Russian National Socialist named Vladimir Zhirinovsky. In his idea of what Russia would be like under his rule. Now, by the way, the term National Socialist is just a way to disguise what they really are, neo-Nazis. In Russia, they call themselves, believe it or not, the Liberal Democrat Party. Well, Zhirinovsky wrote a book titled My Struggle. And that book has been compared to Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle in German. Just as Western leaders tend to ignore the radical Muslim leaders of what they're saying today, they also refuse to pay any attention to what potential Russian dictators are saying. Well, who was this Zhirinovsky character? For starters, even though his father was Jewish, he is radically anti-Semitic. It was a political rally. He was a political ally of Vladimir Putin, and he is a very staunch supporter of Saddam Hussein. And he was up to his ears in the United Nations Oil for Food scandal. That program was started by the United Nations to allow Iraq to sell oil to, if Hussein promised to only use the proceeds of the oil sales to buy food and other essentials for the Iraqi people. It was supposed to ease the pain of the people there that was being caused by the sanctions imposed on Iraq during the thing with Kuwait. But the Iraqi people never saw anything from that program. You see, Hussein exploited the program and ended up with $1.7 billion in his own pocket from kickbacks and bribes. And like most UN programs, it was rife with corruption and mismanagement by UN officials. It was discovered that half of the 4,500 companies participating in the program had paid kickbacks to UN employees to get those very lucrative contracts. And in spite of Zhirinovsky's involvement in the scandal, he received the highest number of votes in the Russian election that was held in December of 1993. He once caused a brawl in the Russian parliament, which is called the State Duma, by spitting on another legislator. The Russians called him the Russian Hitler. Well, Zhirinovsky just barely lost the election for president in 1996, and that is only because Putin had the election rigged in his favor. He enjoyed the support of the Russian military, which at this point is very unhappy with the way things are going under Putin's regime. You see, many soldiers haven't been paid for quite a long time. What's even more important for the purposes of this lesson is the fact that he was in favor of Russian expansion into the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. And he promoted the idea of attacking Israel in his book titled The Last Dash to the South. He even came right out and admitted that if he was elected, he would be a brutal dictator. Listen to what he wrote in his book. I'll start by squeezing the Baltics and other small nations. I don't care if they are recognized by the UN. I'm not going to invade them or anything. I'll bury radioactive waste along the Lithuanian border and put out powerful fans and blow the stuff across the border at night. I'll turn the fans off during the day. They'll all get radiation sickness and die from it. When they either die of it or get down on their knees, I'll stop it. I'm a dictator. What I'm going to do is bad, but I'll be a good Russian. If that sounds like the rantings of a madman, you're right. But remember, that madman almost became the president of Russia a few years ago. The only thing that stopped him from eventually taking over Russia was the fact that he died a few weeks ago on April 6th of this year at the age of 75. I once saw a news story that told of anti-Putin demonstrations when Zhirinovsky was with his cronies and were marching down the streets and a whole bunch of smiling Russians. Remember what I told you a few weeks ago. It is discouragement among the people that sets the stage for dictators to rise to power. And the Soviet Union is in deep cultural and economic distress right now. They don't like the experiment in capitalism. You see, in a capitalistic society, they actually have to work for what they get. And many of the young people who supported him are too young to remember how oppressive that communist system was. And all communism is all they've ever known. And as far as some of the older folks are concerned, even though they thought that communism was an impressive way to live, they'll welcome anyone who promises to get them out of the economic slump they're in right now. Well, Zhirinovsky's plan was to reunite the old Soviet Union by force. And that's what his buddy Putin is trying to do right now in Ukraine. And if Putin continues with Zhirinovsky's plan, after he takes Ukraine, he'll try to make the other republics do the fighting and let the Russians simply give the orders. You may think that this guy is a real nutcase, but believe me, he was dead serious. But the most frightening thing is the average Russian on the street loved him. And Putin is trying to pick up where he left off. Here's some other quotes from Zhirinovsky's books. I say plainly, when I come to power, there will be a dictatorship. I will beat the Americans in space. I will surround the planet with our space stations so that they'll be scared of our space weapons. I don't care if they call me a fascist or a Nazi. Workers in Leningrad told me that even if you wear 5 swastikas, we'll vote for you all the same. You promise a clear plan. There's nothing like fear to make people work better. The stick, not the carrot. I'll do it all without tanks in the streets. Those who have to be arrested will be arrested quietly at night. I may have to shoot 10,000 people, but the other 300 million will live peacefully. I have the right to shoot 100,000. I have the right as president. And in a speech he said, I am the Almighty. I am a tyrant. I will follow in Hitler's footsteps. We will create new Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's. I will not hesitate to deploy atomic weapons. It's sort of frightening to think that the guys like that are in the world today. Zhirinovsky may be dead, but there are others just like him out there, and Vladimir Putin is one of them. Well, think about this. Did you hear of any of that in the news? Trust me, you won't, because our government didn't take this man seriously. The leaders of the Western world still want to believe that Russia has finally embraced capitalism and is our friend. But the Russian people are listening to men like Zhirinovsky, and they like the idea of having Russia rule the world. And who knows what might happen in the next election. You see, there's a rumor around that Putin is currently under the care of an oncologist. In fact, I heard on the news of this week he's going under cancer surgery. And if that's true, that means he's fighting cancer. And some say that he wants to be remembered as the guy who reunited the Soviet Union. But that remains to be seen. Well, what's going to happen when Putin dies and leaves office? Putin keeps winning because he rigs the elections. But he's not going to be in office forever. And when he leaves, someone like Zhirinovsky might actually win this time. Remember, President Putin isn't all that popular right now. A lot of people aren't happy with the Ukrainian debacle that he's gotten them into, especially the Russian army. A lot of Russian soldiers have died in Ukraine, and the soldiers don't think this war was really necessary. Well, if Putin is ousted from office and a power struggle results, there might not be another election. And another Zhirinovsky type might just walk into office with the backing of the Russian military. I mean, after all, in the last decade, Russia has proven to be the nation where anything can happen, and as scary as that might be, that even includes a guy like Zhirinovsky. Now, it's obvious that Zhirinovsky isn't the Russian leader that the Bible calls God, but it should show us that whoever it might be, the atmosphere in Russia is such that the fulfillment of that prophecy can certainly happen today, and Putin's war in Ukraine isn't all that popular with the Russian people. They have already been riots in the street of Moscow protesting the war. Have you heard anything about that on the news? But those riots were put down by force. Okay, unfortunately for them, the Russians and the Muslims are going to make a real tactical error by attacking Israel. They're under the impression that Israel's position is defenseless. I mean, after all, Israel's strongest ally just deserted or desecrated their temple. Surely he wouldn't come to Israel's defense now, so their covenant is off, right? Wrong. The fact is, the Russian leader, whoever it might be, is so confident of his position that he double crosses Egypt and destroys the Southern Alliance as well. Daniel wrote, "He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train." At this point, the Russian army is in Egypt. The Muslims in North Africa, who are mostly Sunni Muslims, have been destroyed. Since the northern Muslims that joined the Russians are mostly Shiites, they aren't really going to shed any tears over the fact that the Sunnis have been annihilated. Well, at this point, the Antichrist launches his attack. I mean, after all, Israel is just too important to let the Russians have it. And let's not forget all the oil in that region of the world. The fact is, most people in the oil industry have been searching for oil in Israel for quite a few years now, and they feel that Israel is actually sitting on a sea of oil at least as large as that in Saudi Arabia. All they need to do is find it. Who knows, by the time all this happens, Israel might be a major oil producer. Now, let's turn our attention to the book of Ezekiel for a moment. Ezekiel wrote, "But on that day, the day when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, declares the Lord, my wrath will be roused in my anger. For in my jealousy and in my blazing wrath I declare, on that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. Now the word translated a great earthquake in the land in verse 19 is the Hebrew word Adamah. It isn't necessarily referring to a natural phenomenon. It literally means soil that has been turned red. God goes on. The fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field and all creeping things that creep on the ground and all the people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down and the cliffs shall fall and every wall shall tumble to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog on my mountain, declares the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother. With pestilence and bloodshed I will enter into judgment with him, and will rain upon him and his hordes, and many peoples who are with him, torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. So I will show my greatness and my holiness, and make myself known in the eyes of many nations, then they will know that I am the Lord. And you, son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O God, you chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about, and drive you forward, and bring you up from the uttermost parts of the north, and lead you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand, and make you arrows drop from your right hand. You shall fall on the mountains of Israel, you and all your hordes, and the peoples who are with you. I will give you to the birds of prey of every sort, and to the beasts of the fields to be devoured. You shall fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the Lord God. After defeating Egypt and the Southern Alliance, the Russians, along with a few Muslim countries that remain, are going to move on to take possession of Israel. The description of torrents of fire and the shaking of the land could be the result of God's direct supernatural intervention into the battle. But it could also describe the use of nuclear weapons against the Russian army. Notice that verse 21 says that God called for a sword against God, and that every man's sword will be against his brother. It's possible that Israel launches its nuclear weapons as part of the Samson option that I talked about earlier. The torrents of rain, the hailstones, the fire, and the burning sulfur are all the results of nuclear explosions. During the explosion of 23 nuclear bombs at the Bikini Atoll between 1946 and 1958, they had ships out anchored around those islands. They noticed that some of the ships used in the test had very large dents in the deck armor that they just could not explain. Well, now they know what caused those dents. It seems that when those bombs went off, tons of water in the lower atmosphere were suddenly thrown into the sub-freezing temperatures of the upper atmosphere, and it returned to Earth in the form of giant hailstones that weighed hundreds of pounds each. It's also possible that some of these weapons could be chemical weapons. So the burning sulfur could refer to the main ingredient of nerve gas, sulfur. But regardless of how it happens, no other army in history is going to be so totally annihilated as this one will be. In Ezekiel 39, verse 12, Ezekiel predicted that so many people are going to die that it will take 7 months to bury the dead. Now let's go back to Ezekiel 39, verse 6 for a moment. I will send fire on Magog and on those who will dwell securely in the coastlands, and they shall know that I am the Lord. The Hebrew word that's translated coastlands is It literally means habitable spot or dried land. It can also be translated country, continent, or island. So according to Ezekiel, Russia isn't the only country that's going to have fire rain down on it. John wrote this in Revelation chapter 6. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to earth as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone slave and free hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. That is a perfect description of a nuclear war. The warheads falling from to earth would look like falling stars. The explosions would literally blow a hole in the atmosphere. And if you've ever watched a mushroom cloud after a nuclear explosion, you'll see that it rolls up like a scroll. The sky is going to go dark, and the sunlight and moonlight will appear red because of all the dust in the air. We get a taste of that phenomenon late in the day when the sun turns red. That's because at that angle, you're seeing the sun through the thickest part of our dusty atmosphere. And the dust blocks out all but the infrared light. Well, Israel fires its nuclear weapons in Russia. The Russians get confused and they just start firing their missiles in return. But some of those missiles are aimed at other countries. So the nations who thought that they were safe and secure under the Antichrist protection will have fire fall on them too. Now this could be from God's direct intervention, but it could also just as easily be God allowing the various nations to launch nuclear weapons against one another. Okay, with the kings of the south and the Russian army destroyed, we only have two spheres of power left on the earth. These two powers are the ones who will fight the last great battle of the war. The battle is called Armageddon. The combatants will be the remaining forces under the control of the Antichrist, and they will meet the vast armies of the Orient under the control of Communist China, the king of the East. After the Antichrist reassembles his remaining forces, he braces to meet the non-rushing armies from the East. Revelation 9 verse 16 says that this army will consist of twice 10,000 times 10,000. Well, if you do the math, that's 200 million men. And not too many years ago, China was boasting that it could mount an army of 200 million men. Now, I don't think for a moment that the Red Chinese are Bible students. So I thought it was funny that they were using the same figure that the Bible uses in the book of Revelation. We find out from Revelation chapter 16, verse 16, that the battle is going to be fought at a place that is in Hebrew is called Armageddon. In the Old Testament, Joah calls this place the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Today, it's called the Valley of Megiddo. And if you look closely at the word Armageddon, you're going to see the word Megiddo in the middle of that. In Revelation 14, verse 20, the Apostle John tells us that so many people will die in this battle that the blood is going to run deep as the horse's bridle for a distance of 200 miles or 185 modern miles. They're Roman miles to 200 miles. There is a very steep ravine that runs from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea that is exactly 185 miles long. Now, some people will say that it's impossible for blood to flow through that ravine for that distance. They claim that blood will clot and will not flow. But what they're forgetting is that blood that has been exposed to high levels of radiation does not clot. That's why cancer patients who are on high levels of radiation as a part of their treatment must have regular blood tests to check the blood platelet count and their INR. Personally, I think that there's a much simpler explanation. It's possible that all those dead bodies that Ezekiel told us about are going to be dumped into that ravine until they can be buried, and they fill the ravine up. And the blood flowing out of those bodies will flow for the full length of that ravine. Now, whether John's description is supposed to be factual or symbolic, we don't know. But carnage on this scale is beyond man's comprehension. But this conflict won't be limited to the Middle East. In Revelation 16, verses 18 and 19, we read, "And there will be flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and great earthquakes such as there has never been since man was on the earth. So great was the earthquake. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell." Whether by some natural means or by some super weapon really isn't clear, but all the cities of the nations will be destroyed. I mean, imagine this, cities like London, Paris, Tokyo, New York, Orlando, obliterated in a matter of minutes. John says in Revelation chapter 9 that the Eastern king is going to kill 1/3 of the world's population. Now, 60 years ago, that was impossible. Do you believe that it's possible today for mankind to destroy 1/3 of the world's population in one day? You bet it is. Isaiah wrote, "Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left." Regardless of what the source of all this destruction is going to be, all of these verses seem to indicate that incredible forces are going to be unleashed across the entire earth at this time. Well, as the Battle of Armageddon reaches its awful climax, it appears that all life on earth is going to be destroyed. But at that very moment, when all seems lost, Jesus is going to return and save mankind from total extermination. Remember what he told us in Matthew chapter 24. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. History is racing toward that final moment. Are you afraid? Or are you looking forward to the rapture and God's deliverance? See, how you answer that question, it should reveal a lot about your spiritual condition. One way or the other, the world continues along that road. And we have no way of knowing how long that road is. But we do know that it only leads to in one direction, the return of Jesus Christ. Okay, we're going to leave the armies fighting for the moment. And next week we're going to look at the final chapter in the history of this earth. We're going to look at the second coming of Christ.